Hello and welcome to this extracurricular class all about writing a high-level literature review. This extracurricular class is brought to you by the Academic Study Skills team here at BIM. If you have any questions about anything, please feel like you can email myself at jesskemp@bim.co.uk or alternatively donnaberwick@bim.co.uk, and we'll be able to answer any questions that you might have. So first up, it's important to consider what is a literature review for. To determine what a literature review is, it's good to discuss what it's actually for. So pause this video and jot down some ideas of what you think a literature review is for. You might have already written one, you might be in the draft process of writing one, or you might not have done one yet to date. So just jot down some ideas and we'll clear up any confusion shortly. So what's a literature review for then? This next slide is brought to you by Dr. Adam Potts from Newcastle University. Here we break down what a literature review is for. He establishes the terms and the context, so how else are you going to define exactly what you're looking at and where its limits are? It presents a survey of preceding literature on the topic, so how else are you going to know what's already been done? It also explores ways that others have solved similar problems and questions. How else are you going to select an appropriate methodology and approach, thinking about your own topic? It outlines the relationship of these texts to each other, because how else are we going to know what different perspectives and debates are and where you're coming from? It evaluates the quality and relevance of the literature, because how else will you be able to build on it or reject it? And I think a takeaway from today's session is all about the gap. It establishes the gaps or the inadequacies. How else are you going to justify your own contribution? Finally, it demonstrates your informed understanding, a key part for academic study. How else will you have faith in your own conclusions? So, to break down a literature review even more and figure out what this is for, a literature review is a critical analysis of existing research in your own field. It highlights both the strengths and the weaknesses of existing research. It allows you to gain a critical understanding of your own field, gives you the opportunity to think about what has been done in your own field, the opportunity to think about the similarities, the patterns, the trends, and also differences across the existing research. By identifying strengths and weaknesses, you'll be able to think about what has not or needs to be done in your field. So again, thinking about those gaps. And the gap in the literature is then your justification for your own research. So think about when you write a rationale for a research project or a dissertation. It's usually because this research hasn't previously been carried out elsewhere. So now we have to think about the literature review as a process, as opposed to just a physical thing. A literature review is a process as well as an outcome, and when we look at it as an outcome, this is something that appears in the final draft of your project report as part of that introduction or as a separate chapter. Whereas a literature review as a process is a critical engagement, so it's thinking, it's reading and it's writing with relevant research on your topic. It's a crucial and formative stage of this research journey. So, within a literature review, we have to evaluate sources critically. We have to think about things like, what were the research aims of the source? Is the research aim achieved, and if so, how well did they do it? Are there any problems with their methodology? What is a strong or a weak research model? How will this research help with your own research? What can you take from it? What needs to be avoided, and what are you doing differently? So all of these questions you'll want to analyse and ask when finding sources for your own literature review. And these might be things that you will actually write down in the physical literature review, or they might just be things that you keep in mind. So when we're talking about critical thinking, I like to use this analogy of a 3-year-old's guide. So if you know anyone of or around that age, you'll know that they ask quite a lot of questions about things, and that's because they're in a learning process and they're trying to expand their knowledge further, which is basically what we're doing with a literature review. So 3-year-olds tend to ask why, how does that work, what's that made of, what's that for, what does that mean? But this person says, How do you know? So what? Says who? And what happens if? So some of those might sound familiar to you if you've ever obviously spoken to somebody of that age. And this is the mindset that we have to adopt when we're looking at different sources that we might want to include in a literature review. So for this task, what I want you to do is read the paragraph that I'm about to put up on the slide. Pause the presentation and see which of these questions link to this paragraph. The paragraph's taken from Green.L 2002 and it's from How Popular Musicians Learn. So think about these questions once you've read this paragraph. Which questions can you ask of this paragraph? Are there any gaps? Is there anything that you can criticise or critique? Think about critical analysis and think about evaluation. So pause the PowerPoint and do that task and we'll come back in a second. Okay, so looking at that paragraph then, we can first of all ask why, because that's quite an overarching question that applies to quite a lot of different sources. Why is this the case? How does that work is something that we could also look at because it's talking about types of listening, attentive listening, and different learning processes. So we can ask for further clarification on how that works. What's that made of might not necessarily fit here, but what's that for can fit. So thinking about attentive listening and purposive listening. What does that mean is something that has sort of two meanings. We can look at different terminology and find out definitions of that, or we can also look at what the analysis of this particular paragraph is. What does Green actually take from that? But this person says, this is a question that we can apply to quite a lot of different things, especially if there is a counter-argument or another point of view that we can compare and contrast. How do you know is one that stuck out to me with this paragraph because there's no additional research in there, there's no references or sources to back up what Green is saying. So what is another one, because then it'll lead nicely into a conclusive paragraph or section. Says who, again because we don't have a reference. Says who says that this is also a central part of the learning process. And then what happens if is another one that we can look at when we're considering alternative points of view. So these are all the types of questions you can ask when looking at your own literature review. Remember the 3-year-old's guide to critical thinking. Ask every question possible until there's nothing else to ask. So for the next section of this lesson then, what I want you to do is think about your own literature review. Whichever level of study that you're at, you might not have written a literature review yet, you might be in the draft process, you might be halfway through. So think about that, write it down, note where you're at, and then everything else from here on contextualise back to your own topic and your own literature review. So we're going to build on some questions now, and building on what you've already have for your own literature review. Whether this is in draft form, whether you're halfway through, or whether you've already previously done one and you're now moving on to another. Jot down some ideas for these questions in terms of your own literature review. So first up, who are the experts on this topic? This can be anything from academics, to governing bodies, to theorists, to theories, etc. Think about that. Who are the experts on your topic? What are the main themes within the source? So pick those out, write them down as headings, and use those moving forward to figure out what else you need to go away and research. What are the main arguments or ideas within that specific source? So these are going to be the things that you're then going to want to look at and pick out which ones you want to use and which ones you maybe want to discard. So these are what you're going to play across against each other within the literature review as well. How have these ideas changed over time? So thinking about topics like something like live streaming, for example. In 2020 and 2021, obviously live streaming is an integral part of the music industry. However, in 2019, although live streaming was still a thing, people now have a different opinion on it. So you need to think about, is the topic that you're researching presenting some kind of issue like that where the ideas might have changed over time? And if they have, you need to mention this in your critical analysis within that literature review. The next question is, what are some of the issues with these ideas or arguments? So is there any limitations, any gaps that you can see? What's gonna present possible issues for your literature review and your research? And finally, what will you do differently? What can you notice from the research you've already done? Are there any gaps? Are there any issues with the research? Has anything been missed? Or using everything that you have found, what are you then going to translate over to your own research and put into your own literature review? Jot some of those ideas down. So now I want to introduce you to the literature review boxes analogy. This is something that I thought up that kind of helps me when thinking about a literature review, because I'm quite a visual learner, so thinking about this in my own head whilst preparing for a literature review, it really helped me out. Imagine you're looking at a huge bookshelf of music industry texts, sources or journals, so i.e. you stood in a library for example. You have 4 empty boxes representing 4 to 6 topics that cover your literature review. And I'm looking at this from the perspective of maybe something like a practical proposal or a practical project or something like that, a research methods project. So maybe not something like a dissertation, because that would probably have a lot more topics to cover, but in this instance we're dealing with 4 to 6 topics, so we've got 4 to 6 empty boxes. Once you've got those boxes, start thinking about what you're actually writing your essay on. So the example I'm going to use is the release of a new single. So for that, we now start to think, what do I need to research in order to do that? Which topics do you need to cover? Well, with this example, we can go for things like maybe songwriting techniques, recording strategies, maybe marketing and design, so things like artwork. We might then want to look at distribution methods, promotion, things like that, okay? So what we do is once we've got those topics, we label each box with a different topic. So in front of us we've got 4 to 6 boxes labelled after each individual topic that we want to cover. From there, what you then do is you start searching for sources, you do some reading, you have a look online, and you find the main arguments and the main ideas and start adding these sources to each box until you've got a nice amount of sources and references and books and articles in each box. From there, what I would like you to do is pause the video and think about, what would you label your boxes? You might have already started to do this, so write it down, have a think about what your boxes are labelled. Is there anything that you've missed? Are there any boxes that can maybe be combined into one box? And think about how many you've got. Have you got enough? Have you got too many? Have a think, pause the video and write these down. The next thing you want to do is start filling those boxes. So remember, you'll want to make sure that things that you're finding, that you find some opposing opinions and different ideologies to allow space for that cross-comparison and that triangulation in your work. So if you're finding that you've got a lot of sources all saying the same thing, start to think about finding some sources that maybe say something either the opposite or slightly different, because then you're going to want to play those against each other when you're writing your literature review. In the middle gap is where you'd bring in your own point of view, and that will be your critical analysis moving forward. So thinking about organising that material then, one of the important things to do in a literature review is identify a debate and make that really clear that you've got opposing points of view that you want to look at individually. So in this instance here we've got source X and source Y. Now source X might disagree with source Y, and that's something that you can comment on in the work. Source X might also agree with source Y and their school of thought, but source X could also build on the conclusions of source Y, so it might be a little bit more advanced. Source X can also confirm the findings of source Y, so these things can be things that they agree with each other, therefore it confirms that those findings are correct and valid and reliable. However, source X can also have reservations about source Y, so it might have some issues with source Y's research, or it might be able to spot some gaps in the existing research out there. Bring that back now to your own research. How does this triangulation of sources then impact your own work? What have you used and what have you not used? The gaps in this research are there for you to fill. So this is for your own primary research to go out and do it. Things that are worthy of investigation. Okay, so we now need to think about which order these boxes are going to come in when you actually sit down to write your literature review. Everyone's going to be different here, but there's some specific ways that you can use to order this information once you've got it all sat there waiting. So chronologically, you could go with, if you are doing something like the example of a live stream. So over time, live streaming as a practice has changed, therefore viewpoints on it will have changed. Think about live streaming now in January 2021, how different that is to March 2020 or even before that time. Things are more advanced, there's more software available, it's a lot more sort of common to talk about live streaming and things like that. It's more common practice. So therefore, in that scenario, it may make more sense to order your viewpoints and your ideologies and your arguments chronologically and then reach a nice end point at the end of your literature review. However, you might also want to order it in themes. So if you're going for something like releasing a single, we're looking at songwriting techniques, recording techniques, promotion and marketing, distribution. All of these things are relevant to that overarching topic of releasing a single. However, within each one, they're their own subtopics. So you're then going to want to make sure that in the literature review they're ordered accordingly in those themes, so it all flows nicely and it's not too kind of convoluted. Everything flows one topic into the next. But again, within each individual topic, you're going to have different viewpoints crossing each other, forming some triangulation, which then ends up with you reaching an end point based on what you've read. You can also do this by trends, different approaches, different techniques, thinking about how maybe if the same project's been done a few times before, how has that person done it? How's that person done it? And then how's that person done it? You can organise it that way. Or a combination of these, depending on what's suitable for your project. Only you will know, but it will make sense once it all starts coming together. And that's the key bit, isn't it? How do we start putting these things in order? Well, it helps to draw a diagram sometimes, or you can create a mind map or a flowchart of ideas, even write a list. Sometimes just getting it down and having a look at it all, maybe different post-it notes on the wall of all the different sources, and then putting them into some sort of order would be useful. So here we've got an example of a mind map. This is a mind map identifying how a basic social media strategy works. So in the middle, we've got the main task of creating a website. However, around the outside, we've got email, social media, video content, blogs and press, podcast and internet radio. So all of these things will have lots of different reading based on each area. However, we're going to want to sort of put all of those together into a literature review to analyse which one's the best to use and what are the pros and cons of each different area. So if you think you're going to find it easier by using a mind map or a flowchart or something similar, then now's the best time to start. Start organising those ideas into something that you can then refer back to when you sit down and write the literature review. Where to start? You don't need to read everything, and you can't. Sometimes the words literature review instill a little bit of fear because we think we've got to sit down for hours and days and weeks just reading our way through different books, different texts. It's not always the case. Sometimes you just need to make sure you're scanning books, skimming through, having a quick look over the glossary and the index and seeing if there's anything in there that's relevant for you and whether you need to then delve deeper and have that sort of spend a bit more time with that specific section of that source. You don't need to read every text, only the relevant ones. You're the judge here. And you don't need to read every word. So within a book, check the contents page. Only read the chapters that are relevant to the project you're about to take on. So a top tip from me is read some literature review examples. If you've never written one before, it's quite daunting, the idea of it. However, if you just have a look at what one looks like, it might make it a little bit easier and provide a bit of context. Take notes on the pros and cons of those and use that good practice within your own literature review. But remember, all literature reviews are different. Dissertation lit reviews are different from project lit reviews, so you need to make sure that the ones you're reading are relevant to what it is that you're going to be doing. And finally, remember, if you're struggling with any of this or you want to ask any questions or you need any further support, we're here to help at the Academic Study Skills team. You can contact the Study Hub inbox via studyhubsmanchester@bim.co.uk. Come along to a study hub on a Monday, Wednesday or a Thursday, Or come and join in with a virtual study space, because why do you need to study alone? Come along on a Tuesday or a Friday for a collaborative online area that's not very just specific for sport. It's more of a collaborative area to share ideas and study amongst like-minded students. The BIM study room isn't running at the moment because of the coronavirus lockdown. However, keep your eyes peeled for once that lockdown's lifted. We may be able to bring that back, and we will aim to do so as soon as possible. Like I said, we're here to help the Academic Study Skills team. If you have any questions or you want to get in touch with us, please feel free to email me at jesskemp@bim.co.uk or email donnaberrick@bim.co.uk, and we'll answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much for watching. We hope you found this useful, and good luck with your literature review.